Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Abul Djabar and the tragedy known to some as the First Silence. Imagine, if you will, the city of Kabul in the early 1970s. The air is thin and crisp, carrying the scent of cedar wood and old stone. Before the world knew the city through the lens of conflict, it was a place of vibrant intersections, where history sat heavily upon the dusty roads. The sun begins its slow ascent over the Hindu Kush mountains, painting the peaks in shades of bruised purple and pale gold. In these early morning hours, the city is usually a symphony of waking life. The distant call of a vendor, the soft shuffling of leather sandals on grit, and the low hum of the wind. But on this morning, a different kind of quiet has taken hold. A silence that feels unnatural, heavy with the weight of something left behind in the dark, waiting to be found as the light touches the earth. Kabul in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a city of remarkable contrast. It was a famous stop on the historic trail through Asia, a place where travelers from the West mingled with local merchants in the bustling markets. The streets were filled with the bright colors of traditional textiles and the sound of many languages. It was a time of relative peace, a period when the mountain air seemed to promise a future of growth and openness. Yet beneath this veneer of cultural awakening, the shadows were deepening. The geography of the city itself offered countless hiding places, from narrow alleyways that wound between ancient brick walls to the desolate stretches of desert just beyond the city limits. It was here, in the spaces between the light of the kerosene lamps and the encroaching dawn, that a predator began to move. He was a shadow among shadows, a man who understood the rhythm of the city's heartbeat and knew exactly when it was most vulnerable, watching from the periphery as the stars began to fade. The first discovery came as the night shift of the world was handing over its duties to the day. A lone laborer, perhaps walking to a site near the outskirts where the city meets the sand, noticed a shape that did not belong. It was slumped near a low stone wall, partially obscured by the long, leaning shadows of the morning. At first, it might have looked like someone merely resting, perhaps a traveler who had found the journey too long and the night too cold. But as the light grew stronger, the stillness of the figure became terrifying. There was no rise and fall of the chest, no soft breath misting in the cool air of the high altitude. When the authorities arrived, they found a young man, his life extinguished in a manner that defied the usual logic of street violence. There were no signs of a desperate struggle, no sounds of a fight that had alerted the neighbors in the nearby houses. There was only the body, and the chilling realization that the end had come with a terrifying, calculated swiftness that left the surrounding dust undisturbed. As the investigators looked closer, their eyes fell upon the instrument of death. In this part of the world, the turban is a symbol of dignity, a piece of fabric woven into the very fabric of daily life and faith. But in the hands of this unknown assailant, the long, sturdy cloth had been transformed into something monstrous. It was a ligature, wrapped with such precision and force that it had silenced the victim before a single cry could be uttered. This detail, the use of a common garment as a weapon of ultimate betrayal, sent a shiver through the community. The cloth, often made of fine cotton or silk, was meant to protect the wearer from the sun and the dust of the road. To see it used to steal the breath of another was a perversion of the local customs that many found impossible to reconcile. It was the first clue in a pattern that would eventually point to a killer of unparalleled cruelty, a man who used the symbols of his own culture to mask his darkest intentions. This first silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the beginning of a long, cold winter for the soul of Kabul. Word began to spread through the tea houses and the bazaars, whispered over steaming cups of green tea as the sun reached its zenith. People spoke of a ghost, a figure who moved with the grace of a desert fox and the heart of a wolf. The authorities were at a loss. In a city where thousands of people moved through the gates every day, How do you find one man who looks like every other man? The fear began to change the way the city slept. Doors that had once been left unlatched were bolted tight. Fathers watched their sons with a new, sharp-eyed anxiety. The vibrant, colorful Kabul of the 1970s started to pull inward, its residents retreating into their homes as soon as the sun dipped below the mountain line. The predator was among them, hidden in plain sight, and as the first victims were laid to rest, the city realized that the silence was only just beginning. We are at the start of a journey into a mind that saw the world through a lens of darkness we can scarcely imagine. Abul Djabar was not a monster from a storybook, but a man of flesh and blood who walked these very streets, breathing the same mountain air as those he hunted. As we move forward into his story, we will see how his shadow grew until it covered nearly 65 confirmed lives, though some believe the number was closer to 300. We will see how the search for justice would lead to a series of tragic mistakes and the execution of the innocent. But for now, let us stay here in the early morning light of 1970, where the dust is still settling and the first questions are being asked. The mountains watch over the city, indifferent to the secrets buried in its soil. As you listen, let the details of this distant time and place wrap around you like a soft blanket. The world outside is far away, and for tonight, you are safe in the quiet of the story. Breathe deeply and let the first silence lead us into the dark. The shadows of the late 1960s and the dawn of 1970 in Kabul were not like the shadows we know today. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meats, and the fine, pervasive dust of the plateau. It was a city where a man could vanish into the crowded bazaars or the quiet, sun-baked outskirts without leaving a ripple. But in those narrow alleys and along the dusty riverbanks, a pattern was beginning to emerge, carved into the very earth by a killer who moved with the silence of the desert wind. The authorities, initially blinded by the sheer scale of the landscape and the simple, brutal nature of the crimes, were slow to see the thread that connected the fallen. To them, these were disparate tragedies, the unfortunate results of street brawls or isolated robberies that had gone too far. They saw the bodies, but they did not yet see the architect behind them. As the body count quietly climbed towards 65, and rumors whispered of numbers reaching into the hundreds, the local constabulary began to notice a chilling consistency. This was not the work of many hands, but the focused, repetitive labor of one. The realization did not come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, sickening dawning. It was found in the way the victims were discovered, often in the twilight hours or the deep middle of the night, their lives extinguished in a manner that left no room for the chaos of a struggle. There were no spent shells, no glinting blades left in the dirt. Instead, there was a terrifying intimacy to the violence. The investigator's lantern would catch the same specific marks on the necks of the deceased, a signature written in bruised flesh that spoke of a very specific, very traditional tool used for a most untraditional end. The tool in question was the lungi, the traditional Afghan turban. In the hands of Abul Djabar, this long, versatile length of fabric, a symbol of culture, dignity, and faith, was twisted into a garrote of lethal efficiency. Imagine the texture of that cloth. In the dry heat of the Kabul province, the fabric is often coarse yet strong, woven to withstand the elements. It is soft enough to be wrapped around the head for hours, but when pulled taut between two powerful hands, it becomes as unyielding as a steel cable. Djabar did not just use it to kill, he used it to control. The sensation of the fabric against the skin was the last thing his victims felt, a slow, suffocating embrace that silenced them before they could cry out into the indifferent night. It was a weapon that left no trace other than the patterns it imprinted on the throat, a silent killer that could be rewound and worn as a garment moments after the deed was done. The psychological weight of this discovery began to press heavily upon the investigators. They were looking for a man who carried his weapon in plain sight, hidden only by tradition. This realization brought with it a profound sense of vulnerability for the men and boys of the city. Anyone passing on the street, anyone sitting at a nearby tea stall, could be the one. The turban, once a common and comforting sight in the tapestry of daily life, began to take on a sinister quality in the eyes of those who knew the truth. They started to look at the way a man wound his cloth, the strength in his wrists, and the stillness in his eyes. The dust of the city streets seemed to settle more heavily now, as if trying to cover the tracks that the authorities were only just beginning to follow. The turban strangler was no longer a ghost. He was a physical presence, a predator who used the very fabric of his society to unravel it. Tragically, the road to identifying Abul Djabar was paved with the gravest of errors. In their desperate scramble to provide answers to a terrified public, the justice system moved with a speed that outpaced its wisdom. 2 innocent men were caught in the gears of this panicked investigation. They were accused, tried, and ultimately executed for crimes they did not commit. Their lives ended by the state, while the true killer continued to walk the streets of Kabul. One can only imagine the dark irony Djabar must have felt, watching from the shadows as others paid the price for his cruelty. It gave him a sense of invincibility, a belief that he was beyond the reach of the law. He continued his hunt, moving through the outskirts with his lungi draped over his shoulder, a silent predator waiting for the next set of patterns to emerge in the dust. The authorities were finally forced to confront the fact that their previous successes were hollow. The bodies kept appearing, the method remained identical, and the fear in the heart of the city only grew. They had to start over, looking past the obvious and into the mundane details of the lives lived on the fringes. They began to study the movements of the people who frequented the remote areas where the bodies were found. They looked for a man who was always there, yet never noticed. A man who possessed the terrifying patience required to wait for the perfect moment of isolation. As we move deeper into the 1970s, the net begins to tighten, but the cost has already been immeasurable. The dust of Kabul holds many secrets, but none as dark as the one Abul Djabar carried beneath the folds of his turban. Kabul in the late 1960s was a city defined by its contrasts. It was a place where the ancient rhythm of the Silk Road met the burgeoning energy of a modernizing nation. In the daylight, the markets were a cacophony of sound. The clatter of copper smiths, the persistent hum of the tea houses, and the heavy, sweet scent of saffron mixing with the acrid smell of diesel from the growing fleet of buses. But as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, the city transformed. The golden light would turn to a bruised purple, and the long, thin shadows of the poplar trees would stretch across the dusty streets like reaching fingers. It was in these shifting lights that Abul Djabar lived. He was not a man who stood out in a crowd. He did not look like the monster the authorities were beginning to realize they were hunting. To any passerby, he was simply another face in the bustling throng, a man of average build and quiet demeanor, moving through the city with a purpose that seemed entirely ordinary. This was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his nature. He moved through the city unnoticed, a phantom draped in the clothing of a commoner. He was a master of the mundane. He understood that in a city of thousands, the most effective disguise is simply to belong. He spent his time in the shared spaces of Kabul, the small corners where men gathered to rest their weary bones after a day of labor. He frequented the mosques and the smaller, more private prayer rooms scattered throughout the neighborhoods. These were places of sanctuary, where the cool stone floors offered a brief respite from the heat, and the low, rhythmic murmur of prayer created a sense of absolute safety. It was here, in these spaces of supposed peace, that Djabar would find his victims. He would watch, his eyes scanning the rooms with a predatory patience, looking for the vulnerable, the young, the isolated, or the travelers who had no one to watch over them in the sprawling city. His movements were calculated and slow. He would often engage in conversation, offering a kind word or a shared moment of devotion, building a bridge of false trust in the sacred silence of the prayer halls. To his victims, he was just another soul seeking spiritual solace. They could not have known that beneath his calm exterior, he was charting their path, timing their departures, and noting the exact moment they would step out into the darkening streets. He preferred the transition times, the moments when the city was neither fully awake nor fully asleep. When the call to prayer had ended and the streets began to empty, he would follow. He moved through the narrow alleyways of the old city with the grace of a man who knew every stone and every dead end. He was the invisible predator, a shadow among shadows, trailing his prey through the labyrinthine corridors of Kabul until the noise of the city faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. When the city grew too crowded or the risk of discovery too high, Djabar would lure his victims toward the outskirts. The transition from the urban sprawl to the desert pathways was seamless under the cover of night. The orange earth of the Kabul province, dry and cracked, swallowed the sound of footsteps. Out there, away from the prying eyes of neighbors and the occasional patrol of the city guard, the isolation was absolute. He would lead men and boys toward secluded areas, perhaps promising work or a shorter route to their destination. The air in these open spaces was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dry sage and distant dust. In the emptiness of the desert, his victims were truly alone. There were no lights from windows to offer hope, only the vast, indifferent sky overhead, and the chilling realization that the man walking beside them was no longer the friend they thought they knew. His chosen weapon was a constant part of his attire, his turban. In the culture of the time, the turban was a symbol of dignity and tradition, a long piece of fabric meticulously wrapped and worn with pride. To see a man wearing one was common. It was a garment that commanded respect. But in Djabar's hands, it was a tool of silent, efficient death. He understood the physics of the cloth, the way it could be unraveled in a heartbeat, the way the soft fabric could become a rigid, unbreakable ligature. There was a sickening irony in his method. He used a garment associated with faith and honor to commit acts of unspeakable depravity. He would wait for the moment of maximum vulnerability, often when the victim's back was turned or when they were distracted by the rugged terrain of the desert paths. The strike was always swift, designed to cut off any cry for help before it could reach the empty horizon. The scale of his invisible campaign was staggering. While the authorities would eventually confirm 65 murders, the dark whispers of the time suggested a much more harrowing reality. Some estimates placed his victim count at over 300 men and boys. It is a number that is difficult to fathom. A small army of souls vanished into the dust. Because he targeted those who lived on the margins or those who could easily be forgotten by a busy society, his crimes went largely unrecorded for years. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated event, a traveler who never arrived, a son who ran away, a laborer who sought work in another province. Djabar relied on this fragmentation. He relied on the fact that the world often looks away from the missing. As he moved through the city day after day, he grew bolder, fueled by the knowledge that he was a ghost in plain sight. But even the longest shadow eventually meets the light. And as 1970 approached, the invisible predator was beginning to leave a trail that even the most reluctant investigators could no longer ignore. As the sun dipped behind the jagged, purple peaks of the Hindu Kush, a peculiar and heavy silence began to settle over the ancient streets of Kabul. It was the early 1970s, a decade that had begun with the promise of modernization and cosmopolitan flair, yet the atmosphere in the capital was curdling. The vibrant energy of the evening markets, once alive with the rhythmic calls of vendors and the scent of roasting lamb, was being replaced by a sharp, cold edge of collective anxiety. This was no longer just a city of commerce and culture. It was becoming a city under a silent, invisible siege. The scale of the disappearances had reached a point where the authorities could no longer dismiss them as isolated incidents or personal vendettas. Instead, they found themselves chasing a phantom that seemed to vanish into the very fabric of daily life, leaving behind nothing but questions and a trail of shattered families. In the crowded chai khanas, the traditional tea houses where men had gathered for generations to discuss poetry, politics, and the news of the day, the conversations had turned to hushed, fearful whispers. Over small glasses of green tea, the steam rising into the dimly lit rooms, the name of the invisible strangler began to take hold. People spoke of a shadow that moved through the peripheral areas of the city, a predator who struck in the quiet corners of alleys or near the darkened outskirts. The concept of a serial killer was not yet a well-established part of the local legal or social vocabulary, which only served to heighten the mystery and the terror. To the people of Kabul, this was something far more supernatural, a demonic force that could pluck a man or a boy from the street without a single witness or a sound of struggle. The weapon itself provided a detail that chilled the heart of the community in a way few other things could. Rumors began to circulate that the killer used a lungi, a traditional Afghan turban, to end the lives of his victims. The turban is a symbol of dignity, a garment of grace and cultural identity worn by men across the nation. To hear that such a common, respected item was being repurposed into an instrument of strangulation was a profound psychological blow. It meant that the killer was not an outsider wearing a mask, but someone who looked like everyone else. He was a man in a turban, standing in a crowd, sitting in a park, or walking behind you in the twilight. This realization turned every stranger into a potential threat, and every shadow into a waiting noose, making the very air of the city feel thick with suspicion. Inside the walls of the Ministry of Interior, the pressure was mounting to a breaking point that the public could scarcely imagine. The police department of the 1970s was a world of paper files, hand-drawn maps, and limited forensic capabilities. They were utterly ill-equipped to handle a predator of this magnitude. Detectives worked by candlelight and the flicker of unreliable bulbs, staring at mounting reports of missing persons that all shared a haunting similarity. The frustration within the ranks was palpable. Every morning, a new file would land on a desk, and every evening, the officers would patrol the streets knowing they were likely being watched by the very man they sought. Public trust was eroding fast. The citizens felt abandoned, and the government was desperate to provide an answer, any answer, to stop the panic from boiling over into the streets. The fear was not merely about the act of death, but the absolute, chilling randomness of it. While the official count would eventually confirm 65 murders, the whispers in the streets suggested a much darker reality, with some claiming the toll was closer to 300 souls. This discrepancy between the known and the feared created a vacuum that was filled by the most terrifying legends. Mothers kept their sons indoors long before the evening call to prayer, and men who once walked home alone across the city now moved in groups, their eyes darting toward every darkened doorway. The social fabric of Kabul, usually defined by its hospitality and openness, was tightening like a knot. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike, as the police scrambled to find a lead in a haystack of rumors and grief. In this climate of extreme desperation, the authorities were driven to make grave and tragic errors. The weight of the public's outcry for justice forced a rush to judgment that would haunt the history of the case forever. Before the true identity of the monster was ever revealed, the state sought to project strength by capturing those they believed were responsible. Records from that time reveal the heartbreaking fact that 2 innocent men were arrested, tried, and ultimately executed for the crimes that Abul Djabar was still actively committing. These men were victims of the city's collective hysteria and a legal system that was drowning in its own inability to solve the unsolvable. Even as they were led to the gallows, the turbaned strangler remained at large, watching from the safety of the crowd as the noose claimed the wrong lives. The siege of Kabul was reaching its zenith. The streets were haunted by the memory of the dead and the fear of who might be next. Every night, the lamps flickered against the wind, casting long, lungi-shaped shadows against the mud-brick walls. The police were no closer to the truth, and the predator was growing bolder, fueled by the knowledge that he was seemingly untouchable. The city was a powder keg of grief and suspicion, waiting for one single moment of light to pierce the darkness. That moment was coming, but it would arrive not through careful detective work, but through a chance encounter in the dead of night that would finally pull the mask off the man who had turned a city of dreams into a landscape of nightmares. The investigators in Kabul found themselves staring into a void. It was the late 1960s, and the city was a tapestry of ancient traditions and burgeoning modernity. Yet, in the shadows of the narrow streets, a predator was weaving a different kind of pattern. The detectives, led by men whose faces were etched with the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights, were hunting a ghost. They called this phase of the case the search for the missing threads because every time a body was discovered, there was nothing to hold on to. No fingerprints were left behind on the cold earth, no discarded weapons, and no clear motive that the logical mind could easily grasp. They moved through the city like men, walking through a heavy fog, where every corner looked the same, and every face in the crowd seemed to harbor a secret. The weapon was the most frustrating element of all. In most crimes of such brutality, there is a signature, a knife, a heavy stone, or a firearm. But here, the killer used a turban. To the police, this was a cruel irony. The turban was a symbol of dignity, a common garment worn by nearly every man who walked the dusty thoroughfares of the capital. It was made of long strips of cotton or silk, ordinary and unremarkable. When the killer unwound the cloth from his head, it became a silent, flexible cord. Once the deed was done, he simply wound it back into place. There was no blood to wash away, no metallic scent to linger on his hands. He walked away from his victims looking exactly as he had when he arrived. A simple traveler, a worker, or a pious man lost in thought. The very fabric of their culture was being used to tear the city apart. The search for witnesses was an exercise in futility. Officers spent their days in the dim light of the samovars, the traditional tea houses where the air was thick with the scent of cardamom and the steam of boiling water. They spoke to the merchants who sold raisins and nuts, and to the children who ran barefoot through the mud. They would ask if anyone had seen a stranger lingering near the alleys. The answers were always the same. Everyone saw everyone, and yet no one saw the killer. In a city of hundreds of thousands, a man in a brown cloak and a gray turban was invisible. He was the background noise of Kabul. The investigators would sit in their small offices, surrounded by handwritten notes and charcoal sketches that captured nothing but the shape of fear. They were looking for a single grain of sand in a desert. When a new victim was found, the scene was always the same, a tragic stillness. The remains were usually discovered in the early hours of the morning, just as the call to prayer began to echo from the minarets across the valley. The victims were often young men or boys, their lives extinguished in the darkness of an alleyway or behind the crumbling walls of an old garden. The detectives would arrive to find the bodies lying in the dust, their faces turned toward the sky. There was a haunting intimacy to the crimes. The killer had to be close, had to feel the life leave his prey. The lack of struggle suggested a terrifying speed or a calculated surprise. Each discovery felt like a personal failure to the men in uniform. They would stand over the remains, the cold morning air biting at their skin, wondering how a human being could commit such acts and then vanish into the sunrise without leaving a single footprint. The weight of the silence was becoming unbearable. The public demand for justice was a physical pressure that squeezed the police department until it began to crack. In their desperation to provide an answer, to give the city a name to hate, the authorities were beginning to look at the margins of society with a dangerous intensity. They needed a culprit, and when you are looking for a ghost, you often find yourself accusing the shadows. This was the most painful part of the investigation. The realization that for every day the real killer remained free, the net would cast wider and wider, catching those who had no way to defend themselves. The threads were not just missing. They were being pulled until the entire social fabric of Kabul began to fray at the edges, leading to mistakes that would haunt the department for decades. As the 1960s drew to a close, the atmosphere in the city was one of quiet, pervasive dread. The Turban Strangler had become a campfire story told in hushed tones, a monster that lived in the dark spaces between the street lamps. The investigators knew he was still out there, watching them, perhaps even walking past them in the crowded squares. He was a master of the mundane, a predator who understood that the best way to hide is to be completely normal. They looked for patterns in the dates and locations, mapping the deaths on a large board in the central station. But the map showed only the results of the violence, not the path of the man who caused it. The threads remained lost, and the killer remained a shadow, waiting for the next moment of silence to strike again. The night air in the outskirts of Kabul during the late 1960s did not carry the soft fragrance of jasmine or the sweetness of the valley orchards. Instead, it was thick with the scent of ancient dust, sun-baked mud bricks cooling in the dark, and the sharp, metallic tang of the mountain wind blowing down from the Hindu Kush. In these shadows, the city felt less like a capital and more like a frontier, a place where the lanterns of the central markets flickered out, leaving only the moonlight to silver the jagged horizon. It was here, in the liminal spaces between the bustling urban center and the silent, desolate highways, that the hunt for the Turban Strangler truly took shape. Two men moved through this darkness with a quiet, deliberate grace that set them apart from the common traveler or the late-night wanderer. These were the keepers of the peace, Sadiq and Aleph, investigators whose names would eventually be etched into the grim history of this case. Sadiq was a man of significant years and even greater patience. He carried himself with the heavy, grounded posture of someone who had seen the city transform from a quiet kingdom into a sprawling, modernizing crossroads. His eyes, narrowed against the grit of the wind, were trained to see what others missed: the subtle shift of a shadow behind a low wall, the unnatural stillness of a figure crouching near a dry irrigation ditch. He knew that the killer they sought, later identified as Abul Djabar, was not a monster from a folklore tale, but a man of flesh and blood who moved with the same rhythms as the working class. Beside him walked Aleph, a younger officer whose energy was tempered by the gravity of their mission. Together, they formed a silent partnership, a unit of two that spoke more through shared glances and slight nods than through words. They understood that in the stillness of the Afghan night, sound traveled like a bell, and a single misplaced footfall on the gravel could alert their prey miles before they ever caught a glimpse of him. Their methodical approach was born from a desperate necessity. The investigation had been plagued by tragedy and error. Already, the pressure from the highest levels of the government had led to the execution of two innocent men, individuals whose lives were extinguished, because the authorities had been too eager to provide a culprit for the mounting pile of 65 bodies. The weight of those two souls sat heavily on Sadiq's shoulders. He did not want another ghost following him. He insisted on a strategy of observation and presence. They spent hours patrolling the northern routes and the dusty passes where laborers and drifters often walked alone. They watched the tea houses where men gathered to rest, and they watched the dark stretches of road where a traveler's only companion was his own shadow. They were looking for a pattern, a glitch in the daily life of the outskirts that would betray the presence of a predator who used the very clothing of his culture, the long, sturdy fabric of the turban, as a tool of sudden, silent death. The texture of their patrol was one of grinding, sensory endurance. They would walk for miles, their boots crunching softly on the parched earth, moving through the outskirts where the houses thinned out and the desert began its slow encroachment. They familiarized themselves with the silhouettes of every poplar tree and every jagged rock formation. They learned to distinguish between the rustle of a stray dog and the rhythmic breathing of a man waiting in the dark. The investigators knew that the turban strangler targeted those who were most vulnerable: the young, the poor, and the solitary. To catch him, they had to think like the men who walked these roads out of necessity. They had to feel the vulnerability of the open highway and the suffocating closeness of the narrow alleyways. Aleph often adjusted his own garment, feeling the weight of the cloth around his neck, a constant reminder that the weapon they were searching for was hiding in plain sight on the heads of thousands of citizens. There were nights when the wind would howl so fiercely that it felt as though the mountains themselves were screaming, masking any sound of a struggle. On those nights, Sadiq and Aleph would stand perfectly still for long stretches, tucked into the alcove of a mud-walled garden, their breaths forming faint clouds in the chill air. They were waiting for a specific kind of movement, something hurried, something predatory. They were not looking for a chase, they were looking for a capture. Their methodology was a rejection of the frantic, haphazard arrests of the past. They were rebuilding the dignity of the law through the simple, exhausting act of vigilance. They analyzed the reports of the missing, noting that many disappearances happened near the irrigation canals or the outskirts of the industrial zones. It was a slow burn of an investigation, a chess match played across the darkened map of Kabul, where the stakes were measured in human lives and the board was made of stone and sand. As the weeks stretched into months, the two investigators became part of the landscape of the outskirts. The locals began to recognize the two tall figures who moved like ghosts through the midnight hours. Though they rarely spoke to the civilians during their watch, their presence offered a sliver of hope to a population paralyzed by the fear of the strangler. They were the thin line between the peaceful sleep of the city and the violent appetites of a man who was suspected of murdering as many as 300 victims. Every step they took was a defiance of the chaos that Abul Djabar had unleashed. They were the keepers of the peace, walking a beat that seemed to have no end, beneath a sky that held 10,000 stars but offered no answers. They were certain of only one thing: the killer would grow bold, he would return to his hunting grounds, and when he did, they would be waiting in the shadows, ready to bring the reign of the turban strangler to a final, definitive halt. The twilight on the outskirts of Kabul in the late 1960s carried a specific kind of stillness. It was a time when the dust of the day began to settle, coating the jagged rocks and the sparse vegetation in a fine, gray powder. The air would cool rapidly, smelling of wood smoke from distant cooking fires and the dry, ancient scent of the earth. For months, the local people had lived under a growing shadow, a fear that had no name but many faces. They spoke of the disappearances in hushed tones, wondering who would be the next to vanish into the vast, unforgiving landscape. The two investigators we followed in our previous chapters were deep in the heart of this mystery, searching for a phantom who left no clues behind, only a trail of grief that stretched across the valleys. On one particular evening, the silence was nearly broken by a young man making his way along a narrow, winding path that cut through the rocky foothills. He was a traveler, someone who knew the terrain, but was perhaps too trusting of the solitude. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving a bruised purple sky in its wake. As he walked, the rhythm of his own footsteps was the only sound, until a figure emerged from the lengthening shadows of a large boulder. The stranger did not seem threatening at first. He appeared to be a man of modest means, dressed in the traditional attire of the region, his face partially obscured by the way he held himself. He approached with a limp, or perhaps just a weary gait, and called out a greeting that was polite and steeped in the customs of hospitality. The stranger asked for assistance, claiming he had lost a small item further down a side trail, or perhaps that he needed help with a burden. It was a simple request, the kind of plea that an honest person find difficult to refuse. They began to walk together, moving away from the main path and toward a more secluded area where the cliffs rose high on either side, blocking out what little light remained. The young man noticed that the stranger was quiet, his movements strangely fluid for someone who had seemed tired only moments before. There was a tension in the air, a sudden absence of the evening bird song, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The stranger reached into the folds of his garment, adjusting the heavy cotton turban that was draped over his shoulder, a common accessory that would soon become a symbol of terror. Without warning, the atmosphere shattered. As the young man turned to point toward a distant landmark, the stranger moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. The length of the turban, a sturdy piece of cloth known as a lungi, was whipped around the young man's neck before he could even gasp. The force was immense. The killer did not use his hands to strike. He used the leverage of the fabric, twisting it with a practiced, lethal efficiency. The victim felt the world begin to spin, the cold air suddenly replaced by the hot, suffocating pressure of the cloth. He was pulled backward, his heels dragging in the dirt, as the assailant grunted with the effort of the struggle. It was a silent, desperate battle in the dark, where the only thing that mattered was the next breath that refused to come. In that moment of near death, a flicker of survival instinct took hold. The young man managed to wedge his fingers between his throat and the tightening ligature, creating just enough space to prevent his windpipe from collapsing entirely. He kicked out blindly, his boot connecting with something solid, the assailant's shin or knee. The killer, surprised by the sudden resistance from a victim he expected to fade quickly, lost his footing on the loose gravel. For a split second, the tension on the cloth eased. It was the only window the young man needed. He wrenched himself free, the rough fabric scraping the skin from his neck as he scrambled away into the darkness. He did not look back, running until his lungs burned, and his heart felt as though it would burst through his chest, guided only by the distant, flickering lights of a village. When he finally reached the safety of a populated area, his appearance was enough to stop the locals in their tracks. His clothes were torn, his eyes were wide with a primal fear, and around his neck was a deep, angry bruise that would eventually turn a dark, mottled purple. He was brought before the authorities, and for the first time, the investigators had something more than a cold body to examine. They had a living witness. His voice was a raspy whisper as he described the man in the shadows. He spoke of a person who was not a giant, but who possessed a strength that felt supernatural. He described the assailant as having broad shoulders and hands that were thick and calloused, the hands of a laborer. Most importantly, he spoke of the killer's eyes, cold, detached, and devoid of any human emotion. The description was vague, yet it was the first crack in the wall of silence that had protected Abul Djabar. The investigators now knew they were looking for a man who used a turban as a weapon, a detail that tied several disparate cases together into one horrifying narrative. This survivor's account provided a profile. A man who could blend into a crowd, who understood the geography of the outskirts, and who used the guise of a humble traveler to lure his prey. The search was no longer for a ghost, but for a man of flesh and blood who walked the same paths as his victims. As the word spread through the markets and tea houses of Kabul, the fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It became a sharp, watchful alertness. The predator was no longer invisible, and the hunt was beginning to narrow. The city of Kabul in the year 1970 was a place of deep, contrasting shadows. By day, the sun-baked streets hummed with the vibrant energy of the ancient bazaars and the influx of foreign travelers seeking enlightenment on the world-famous hippie trail. But as the sun dipped behind the jagged, unforgiving silhouette of the surrounding mountains, a different kind of energy took hold. It was a cold, sharp stillness that seemed to cling to the mud-brick walls and the narrow, winding alleys of the old quarters. The police were no longer just patrolling. They were waiting. The first crack in the wall of silence had finally given them a sense of direction, but it had not yet given them a face. They knew he was out there, a phantom who used a simple turban as a deadly garrote, leaving behind a trail of victims that had already reached numbers the public could barely comprehend. In the oppressive silence of those nights, the investigators became part of the landscape, melting into the darkness. The stakeout was a grueling test of human endurance and mental fortitude. Men huddled in the deep recesses of ancient doorways, their heavy wool coats providing little protection against the biting Afghan winter. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, stale cardamom, and the lingering aroma of wood fires from the homes of families long since asleep. They communicated in whispers, or, more often, through subtle hand signals, afraid that even the sound of a human voice would startle the predator they sought. The investigators would spend 8, 10, or 12 hours at a time standing perfectly still, their eyes scanning every movement in the gloom. The physical toll was immense. Their limbs would grow numb, and their vision would blur as they stared into the dancing shadows of the moonlight, wondering if every shifting patch of gray was the man they called the Turban Strangler. It was a game of infinite patience, played against a man who had already proven himself to be a master of the night. The weight of the past hung heavily over these operations. The investigators were haunted by the knowledge that the justice system had already failed twice. 2 innocent men had been arrested, tried, and executed for the very crimes they were now watching for. Those men had gone to the gallows, while Abul Djabar continued to walk the streets, invisible and unrepentant. This realization fueled a quiet desperation among the officers. They couldn't afford another mistake, another wrongful accusation that would leave the real killer free to strike again. They knew that Abul Djabar was not a creature of legend, despite the terrifying stories whispered in the tea houses. He was a man of flesh and blood, someone who lived among them, perhaps even someone who nodded to them in the market during the day. The thought that he might be watching them while they watched for him was a constant, chilling possibility that kept their nerves frayed and their pulses quick. In the deep of the night, Kabul speaks in a language of small, terrifying sounds. The investigators learned to distinguish the natural rhythms of the city from the anomalies that signaled trouble. They heard the rhythmic clatter of a stray dog's paws on the frozen ground, the distant, mournful baying of a wolf in the hills, and the occasional creak of a wooden shutter catching a stray gust of wind. But then there would be a sound that didn't fit, the soft, muffled slide of fabric against a stone wall, or the crunch of a single pebble under a deliberate footstep. In those moments, the air would seem to freeze in their lungs. They would reach for their weapons, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. But time and again, the shadow would turn out to be a night watchman or a restless resident. The predator remained elusive, always appearing where the police were not, as if he possessed a sixth sense for the traps they were setting. It was as though he were mocking them from the very shadows they inhabited. The psychological weight of the hunt began to manifest in the officers' dreams. They imagined the texture of the turban cloth, the way it would feel to have it tighten around a neck, the silence that would follow as the life was snuffed out of a young boy or a weary traveler. They thought of the 65 confirmed victims and the rumors that the true count might be over 300. The scale of the depravity was overwhelming. Every night they spent in the cold was a night they hoped would be the last, yet the sun would inevitably rise over the peaks of the Hindu Kush, illuminating an empty street and another failed vigil. They were exhausted, their faces lined with fatigue and the grit of the city dust. Yet they returned to their posts every evening, driven by the need to end the cycle of terror. They knew that Abul Djabar was becoming bolder, and that eventually his predatory hunger would force him into the light. They just had to be there when it happened. As October progressed, the tension in the city reached a breaking point. The stakeouts were expanded, drawing in every available resource. The investigators began to focus on the specific areas where the most recent attacks had occurred, narrowing the net. They studied the patterns of the victims, mostly men and boys who were vulnerable or isolated. They looked for the common thread in the geography of the kills. It was a slow, agonizing process of elimination. They were no longer just reacting. They were trying to think like the man with the turban. They looked for the dark corners near the parks and the quiet stretches of road leading out of the city. The nights grew even colder, the frost silvering the ground and making every movement audible. The hunters were becoming as still and as dangerous as the man they pursued. Somewhere in the darkness, Abul Djabar was preparing his next move, unaware that the shadows he loved were finally starting to watch him back. The long wait was almost over, and the final confrontation was drawing near, hidden just beyond the next turn in the alley. The air in Kabul during the late weeks of October in 1970 was a living, breathing weight. It carried the scent of drying mud, the faint, sharp tang of charcoal fires, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence pressing against the skin. For months, the city had been held in the grip of an invisible predator, a man who moved through the darkness like a ghost, leaving a trail of mourning families in his wake. The tension was no longer just a feeling. It was a visible strain on the faces of the shopkeepers, who closed their stalls early, and the parents who pulled their children inside long before the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. Tonight, the shadows felt longer than usual, stretching across the dusty thoroughfares of the capital, hiding the one they called the Turban Strangler. In the deep recesses of a narrow alleyway, two men sat in absolute stillness. Their names were Sadiq and Alif, two police officers whose lives had become consumed by the pursuit of a shadow. They had spent countless nights like this, their breath misting in the cooling air, their eyes strained from peering into the gloom. They were positioned near a patch of wasteland that had become a frequent haunt for the desperate and the unwary. Sadiq adjusted his position slightly, the rough wool of his coat scratching against his neck. He looked at Alif, whose face was a mask of concentration, illuminated only by the faint, distant glow of a single street lamp. They didn't speak. In the stillness of a Kabul night, even a whisper could travel for blocks, and they knew that their target possessed the ears of a fox. As the clock moved toward the midnight hour, the atmosphere shifted. A lone figure emerged from the darkness, walking with a slow, rhythmic gait that suggested either exhaustion or a complete lack of concern. Behind him, another shape materialized. It was a man, average in height, draped in traditional clothing that blended perfectly with the earthen walls of the buildings. This was Abul Djabar. He moved with a terrifying grace, closing the distance between himself and the unsuspecting traveler with the predatory patience of a leopard. Sadiq felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic, hollow thumping that seemed loud enough to wake the entire district. He reached out and gripped Alif's arm, a silent signal that the moment they had prayed for, the moment that had cost 65 lives and perhaps many more, was finally unfolding before their eyes. They watched, paralyzed for a heartbeat by the sheer horror of the ritual. Djabar reached for his head, unwinding the long, heavy fabric of his turban with a fluid, practiced motion. This wasn't just clothing. It was his signature, his weapon, a length of cloth that had ended dozens of lives in the silence of the night. He stepped into the traveler's personal space, his movements devoid of hesitation. The victim didn't even have time to turn around before the fabric was looped. The officers saw the tension in Jabar's shoulders, the sudden, violent surge of energy as he began to tighten the coil. In that instant, the silence of Kabul was shattered. Sadiq and Alif broke from their cover, their boots pounding against the hard-packed earth as they surged forward, shouting commands that tore through the stagnant air. The struggle was brief but desperate. Djabar, surprised by the sudden intervention, did not flee immediately. Instead, he turned with a snarl, his hands still clutching the ends of the turban. Alif lunged first, tackling the man into the dust, while Sadiq wrestled the weapon from his grip. They rolled in the dirt, a chaotic tangle of limbs and gasping breaths. The victim, terrified and gasping for air, scrambled away into the darkness, leaving the three men to their violent dance. Finally, the weight of the two officers overcame the killer. They pinned his arms behind his back, the metal of the handcuffs clicking into place, with a finality that seemed to echo across the valley. As they pulled him to his feet, the light of their torches fell upon his face. He looked remarkably ordinary, a man who could have been a neighbor, a baker, or a friend. But in his eyes, there was a coldness that chilled the officers more than the autumn night ever could. With Abul Djabar secured, the long walk to the station began. The city seemed to watch them as they passed, the windows of the mud-brick houses like unblinking eyes. The cycle was broken. The terror that had claimed over 65 victims and led to the tragic, mistaken execution of 2 innocent men in the years prior had finally been unmasked. Sadiq and Alif walked in silence, the adrenaline slowly fading to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion. They had caught the turban's strangler in the act, ending a reign of darkness that had scarred the heart of Afghanistan. As they entered the precinct, the magnitude of their catch began to ripple through the ranks. The final struggle was over, and though the healing would take decades, the predator was no longer roaming the shadows of 1970. The interrogation room was a small, airless space buried deep within the heart of the station, where the heavy scent of old paper and burning kerosene hung in the stagnant atmosphere. The walls, constructed from thick, sun-baked mud bricks, seemed to absorb the sounds of the city outside, leaving only a dense, ringing silence that pressed against the ears. In the center of this room sat a simple wooden table, its surface scarred and darkened by years of use, and a single lantern that cast long, distorted shadows into the corners. The light was orange and flickering, creating a rhythmic pulse that felt like a slow, heavy heartbeat against the gloom. Across from the investigators sat Abul Djabar. He was a man who looked remarkably ordinary, his features weathered by the relentless sun and high winds of the region. His hands rested motionless on his lap, and there was no rage in his expression, only a terrifying, vacant calm that made the air feel colder than the autumn night truly was. The lead investigator, a man whose patience was as worn as the stones of the city, leaned forward into the narrow circle of light. He did not raise his voice or use force. Instead, he spoke in a low, measured tone that matched the gravity of the questions he had to ask. He watched Jabar's eyes, looking for a flicker of remorse or even a shadow of fear, but he found only a deep, bottomless stillness. On the table between them lay the primary piece of evidence that had been gathered during the arrest. It was a long, heavy length of fabric, a turban of the same kind worn by men all across the country. In this room, however, it was no longer a symbol of tradition. It was a weapon of silence. The coarse weave of the cloth seemed to hold the weight of every life it had extinguished, and as the lantern light caught the fibers, it seemed to pulse with a dark, hidden history. As the hours of the night stretched toward the early morning of 1970, the conversation shifted from the circumstances of his arrest to the long trail of shadows he had left behind. The investigator began to list dates and locations, referencing quiet mountain passes, darkened alleyways, and the outskirts of bustling markets where people had vanished without a trace. With each mention, Djabar would nod, a slow and deliberate movement of his head. He began to describe the feel of the fabric in his hands and the way he would wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability in his victims. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely more than a whisper, yet it filled the room with a sense of mounting dread. He spoke of the men and boys who had crossed his path, individuals who were simply trying to find their way home, never knowing they were being watched by a predator who moved like a ghost through the dusty streets. The initial suspicion of the authorities was already grim. They had linked him to a string of disappearances that had haunted the region for several years. When the number 65 was first spoken aloud, a heavy gasp seemed to escape the very walls of the room. 65 lives. It was a figure so large it was difficult to comprehend, a staggering tally of loss that would have made him one of the most prolific killers in history. The investigators exchanged glances, their faces pale under the flickering yellow light. They thought they had reached the end of the horror, that they finally understood the magnitude of the man sitting before them. But as Jabbar continued to speak, his memories flowing like a dark, unstoppable river, the investigators realized with a sinking feeling in their chests that 65 was merely the beginning of the truth. The true scale of the tragedy began to emerge as the night wore on and the moon climbed high over the mountains. The investigators sat in stunned silence as the math of his crimes began to shift. The numbers climbed steadily, moving past the confirmed cases into a realm of pure nightmare. While he would eventually be convicted for the deaths of 65 people, the authorities began to piece together a much larger map of his movements over the previous decade. Based on his calm admissions and the patterns of his travel, the suspected death toll began to rise toward a number that defied belief. 300. The possibility that 300 men and boys had met their end at the hands of this one man was a weight that threatened to break the spirit of everyone in that room. 300 families left wondering. 300 lives cut short in the silence of the night. This revelation changed everything for the city and the nation. It was no longer just a series of local crimes. It was a profound wound that stretched across the landscape. The weight of truth was not just in the numbers, but in the realization of how long he had operated in the shadows, unnoticed and unchecked by those meant to protect the people. Perhaps most tragic of all was the discovery that 2 innocent men had already been executed for crimes that Jabbar was now claiming as his own. This realization added a layer of bitter, suffocating irony to the investigation. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the high, barred window of the cell, the interrogation came to a temporary pause. The man across the table remained as calm as he had been at the start, seemingly untouched by the magnitude of the horror he had just described, while the investigators stepped out into the morning air, carrying the heavy burden of 300 lost souls. The courtroom in Kabul was a chamber of heavy, expectant silence as the proceedings began. The air seemed to thicken with the collective memories of the lost, pressing against the stone walls of the judicial building. Abul Djabar sat in the center of this storm, a figure of small stature but monumental shadow, surrounded by the sterile machinery of the law. The morning light filtered through high, dusty windows, casting long, slanted beams that illuminated the swirling particles of dust like tiny ghosts dancing in the stillness. There was no grand spectacle of defense, no elaborate weaving of stories to shield him from the truth. The evidence gathered was a mountain of grief that could not be scaled or ignored. Every piece of cloth and every witness statement sat upon the tables like leaden weights. The city outside held its breath. The bustling markets and narrow alleys momentarily hushed as the weight of 65 confirmed lives pressed down upon the heart of the capital. The trial moved with a rhythmic, almost mechanical precision. In the legal landscape of 1970, the wheels of justice in Afghanistan could turn with a terrifying swiftness when the crimes were this profound. The prosecution did not need to linger on rhetoric. They simply laid out the geography of a nightmare. They spoke of the hillsides, the darkened corners near the mosques, and the paths where men walked alone, thinking they were safe in the shadows of their own city. The judge, a man whose face was etched with the gravity of his office, listened as the number 65 was repeated over and over, until it lost its quality as a digit and became a chorus of individual tragedies. It was whispered in the corridors that the true number of victims might have exceeded 300, a figure so vast it threatened to swallow the room whole. Yet, for the purpose of the law, the 65 counts were more than enough to seal a fate that had been written the moment his hands were first bound in iron. As the verdict was read, there was no outcry, only a deep, resonant exhaling of breath from those gathered in the gallery. The sentence was death. There were no lengthy appeals, no years of waiting in the liminal space of a prison cell. The year 1970 was a time of direct and final consequences. In the short days leading up to the end, the prison walls seemed to absorb the tension of the entire nation. Abul Djabar remained a cipher, a man who had walked among his neighbors while carrying a darkness that few could fathom. The guards moved through the corridors with a quiet solemnity, their keys clinking softly against their hips, a metallic ticking of the clock toward the inevitable. The families of the victims began to gather in the city, drawn by a magnetic need to see the conclusion of their long, agonizing journey through the unknown, carrying photographs worn thin by touch and memories that had become jagged edges in their minds. The morning of October 21st broke with a crisp, biting cold that signaled the deepening of autumn. The sky was a pale, translucent blue, the color of ice before it thickens. In the public square, the gallows had been erected, a stark wooden frame that stood against the horizon like a skeletal finger pointing toward the heavens. The wood was raw and unweathered, smelling faintly of pine and fresh sawdust. A crowd had gathered in the pre-dawn light, not out of a thirst for spectacle, but out of a desperate, quiet necessity for closure. Thousands of eyes were fixed on the platform, watching as the shadows retreated from the wood. The air was so still that the sound of a distant bird or the shuffling of a foot on the gravel carried for blocks. It was a moment where time seemed to fold in on itself, connecting the ancient traditions of justice with the immediate, visceral pain of a city that had been terrorized for far too long. When the prisoner was led onto the platform, he appeared diminished by the scale of the morning. The rope, thick and coarse, was prepared with a grim efficiency that matched the speed of his trial. The texture of the hemp was rough, a final, tactile reminder of the physical world he was about to leave behind. There were no final words that could bridge the gap between his actions and the humanity he had discarded. As the mechanism was triggered, a collective shiver seemed to pass through the crowd, a physical manifestation of the release of a decade of fear. The snap of the rope was a singular, definitive punctuation mark at the end of a long and bloody sentence. In that instant, the Kabul strangler ceased to be a living threat and became a part of the city's dark history. The body swayed slightly in the morning breeze, a lonely pendulum marking the end of an era of terror that had haunted the dreams of thousands. For the families standing in the shadows of the square, the reaction was not one of joy, but of a profound, hollow relief. They stood in small clusters, leaning on one another, their faces wet with tears that had been held back for years. The weight of the moment was further burdened by the knowledge that two innocent men had already paid with their lives for these crimes before the true killer was caught. This final judgment was a correction of a terrible error as much as it was a punishment for Djabar. A mother who had lost her son in the prime of his youth closed her eyes and let the pale sun warm her skin for the first time in many seasons. The justice delivered in 1970 could not restore the laughter to the dinner tables or fill the empty chairs in the tea houses, but it offered a boundary. As the crowd slowly dispersed into the winding streets, the square was left to the wind, the memory of the 65 etched into the stones of Kabul forever. The morning of October 22nd, 1970, arrived in Kabul with a clarity that the city had not known for years. As the sun began its slow ascent over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, the first light touched the ancient stones of the capital, turning the rising dust into a shimmering, golden haze. For many months, the dawn had brought only a weary sense of survival, a realization that another night had passed under the shadow of a phantom. But on this morning, the air felt different. It was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dried apricots from the markets, unburdened by the heavy, suffocating weight of the unknown. The execution of the man the world called the Turban Killer had taken place just a day before, and as the news rippled through the narrow alleys and the wide boulevards, a collective breath, held for so long it had become painful, was finally released. In the quiet offices of the local constabulary, the frantic energy of the chase had been replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. The investigators sat among stacks of paper that documented a tragedy of nearly unfathomable proportions. There were 65 confirmed names in those files, 65 lives that had been snuffed out in the darkness. Some whispered that the true number was closer to 300, a figure so vast it seemed to defy the reality of a single human life. The detectives looked at the evidence, the simple, mundane lengths of cloth that had been twisted into instruments of terror. It was a haunting reminder that the most profound evil often wears the most ordinary mask. They had worked until their eyes were bloodshot and their spirits were frayed. And while the capture of Abul Djabar brought a sense of professional completion, it offered little comfort for the sights they had seen in the dim corners of the city. But the legacy of this case carried a darker, more somber weight than the crimes themselves. In the desperate, feverish rush to stop the killings, the mechanisms of justice had faltered. 2 innocent men had been executed in the years prior, their lives sacrificed to a system blinded by social pressure and the urgent need for a scapegoat. Their names, often lost in the sensational headlines of the killer's atrocities, remained a quiet, stinging rebuke to the investigators. This tragedy became a turning point for the city's legal memory, a reminder that in the search for a monster, one must be careful not to trample the very justice they seek to protect. The healing of Kabul would require more than just the removal of a predator. It required a slow, painful reconciliation with the errors made in the name of safety. As the weeks turned into months, the rhythm of daily life began to stitch the city back together. The tea houses, once sites of hushed whispers and anxious glances toward the door, reclaimed their role as sanctuaries of conversation. Men sat on low wooden benches, cradling warm glasses of green tea flavored with cardamom, their voices rising and falling in the familiar cadence of gossip and trade. The gardens of Babur, with their tiered terraces and ancient pomegranate trees, became places of leisure once more. Families strolled through the parks as the evening sky turned a deep, bruised purple, no longer checking over their shoulders or quickening their pace at the sound of a distant footfall. The city was reclaiming its night, reclaiming the peace that had been stolen by a man who moved like a ghost through the shadows. Kabul in the early 1970s was a place of vibrant transition, a city often remembered as being in its golden age. The memory of the turban killer slowly drifted from the front pages of the mind to the dusty archives of the past. It became a cautionary tale, a dark piece of folklore told to children to ensure they stayed within the safety of the courtyard walls before the lamps were lit. But the fear no longer had teeth. The resilience of the Afghan people, a strength forged over centuries of crossroads and conquests, proved to be the ultimate antidote to the darkness Abul Djabar had tried to sow. They moved forward with a quiet dignity, honoring the lost not by dwelling on the violence of their end, but by flourishing in the sunlight that followed. The investigation eventually faded into the specialized studies of criminal history, a landmark case that changed how the local authorities viewed the patterns of the human mind. The name of the killer became a footnote, a grim reminder of a period of terror that the city had successfully outlived. The physical evidence was destroyed or locked away, and the squares where crowds once gathered in fear were reclaimed by the mundane sounds of traffic and commerce. The city of Kabul, standing at the heart of the Silk Road, continued its long journey through time, carrying its scars with grace. The shadow had passed, and the light, though sometimes fragile, remained. As we leave the winding streets of 1970, we find ourselves back in the quiet of the present. The stories of the past serve to remind us of the strength found in community and the enduring nature of hope, even when the night seems at its darkest. The mountains still stand guard over the valley, and the wind still carries the echoes of 1,000 stories through the passes. But those echoes are soft now, like a lullaby meant to guide us into the stillness of sleep. The terror is gone, replaced by the rhythmic breathing of a world at rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.